The high desert wind carries the scent of dust and distant rain, a promise it rarely keeps. It whips around the corner of the dry goods store, kicking up a cloud of grit that stings Dr. Elias Thorne's eyes. He pulls his hat down, the brim doing little to stop the fine, red powder from settling on the shoulders of his white linen coat. In this town, perched on the raw edge of the territory, the coat is his uniform, his symbol. It declares him a man of science, of learning, of Boston civility dropped carelessly into a world of hard rock and harder men. It is also, he is beginning to learn, a target. He quickens his pace, his worn leather bag slapping against his thigh. A message had come an hour ago. A boy at the Tanner homestead, thrown from a horse, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. The homestead is a good 5 miles out, nestled in a shallow canyon that some say is cursed and others say is just plain unlucky. As he approaches the livery, a knot of men loitering by the water trough straightens up. Their eyes, narrowed against the sun, fix on him. On his coat, one of them, a man with a stained beard and a pistol slung low on his hip, spits a stream of tobacco juice that lands perilously close to Elias's boot. "Playing doctor for the squatters again, Thorne," the man sneers. The others chuckle, a low, rumbling sound like stones grinding together. Elias ignores them, his jaw tight. He knows the Tanners are good people, homesteaders trying to scratch a life from this unforgiving soil. They are also on land that Silas Croft, the cattle baron whose shadow lay over the entire county, has decided he wants. Croft's methods of persuasion are well known, and the men at the trough wear his brand as surely as his cattle. "Best be careful out there," another man calls out, his voice slick with false concern. "Easy to get lost in them canyons. An educated man like you might not be found for a long while." The threat hangs in the air, as sharp and clear as the crack of a whip. Elias keeps walking, his back ramrod straight, every nerve ending screaming at him. He feels their eyes on him, a physical pressure against the white fabric of his coat. This is more than just a warning. This is a promise. He knows, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that his journey to the Tanner place will be a dangerous one. He is a doctor, a healer. But here, in this sun-bleached corner of the world, that seems to be the most dangerous thing a man can be. His mission is to mend a broken bone, but the greater challenge, he suspects, will be surviving the ride. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. The path to the homestead is little more than a pair of ruts carved into the hardpan, winding through mesquite and sentinel-like saguaros that cast long, skeletal shadows in the afternoon light. The air is still, the kind of predatory silence that precedes violence. Elias feels it in the prickling of his skin, in the way his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Gideon, keeps flicking its ears, alert to sounds he cannot hear. The laughter of Croft's men echoes in his mind, a venomous counterpoint to the rhythmic clopping of Gideon's hooves. He'd come west 6 months ago, filled with a naive idealism forged in the lecture halls of Harvard Medical School. He'd imagined bringing modern medicine to the frontier, being a force for good, for progress. He'd pictured grateful mothers and stoic fathers, a community built on mutual respect. The reality was the town of redemption, a place named for a hope it had long since forgotten. It was a town of dust, desperation, and divides sharper than any surgeon's scalpel. The divide between the wealthy and the poor, the white settlers and the Apache, whose ancestral lands these were. And then there was Silas Croft. Croft owned the biggest ranch, the town's only saloon, and by most accounts, the sheriff. He saw the world in terms of assets to be acquired, and the small homesteads and Apache watering holes were assets he intended to possess. Elias, by treating the sick and injured on both sides of that divide, had unwittingly become an obstacle. A healthy community was a stubborn community. A doctor who gave people the strength to hold on was a threat to a man who wanted them gone. He was halfway through the canyon when the silence broke. It wasn't a shout or a warning. just the sharp, dry crack of a rifle shot. The sound was instantly followed by the high-pitched whine of a bullet passing so close to his ear he felt the air shift. Instinct took over. Elias threw himself from the saddle, landing hard in the dust and scrambling behind a cluster of rust-colored boulders. Gideon, bless his steady heart, bolted a few yards before stopping, his sides heaving. Another shot kicked up dirt where his head had been a second before. He was pinned down. His medical bag lay in the open, a dozen yards away. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, terrifying silence. He peered over the edge of the rock. He could see nothing. The shooter was hidden, patient. A professional. Elias pressed himself flat against the warm stone, the rough surface scraping his cheek. The white coat, which he'd once worn with such pride, now felt like a shroud. It was a beacon, a pristine white target against the ochre landscape. They weren't just trying to scare him. They were trying to kill him. And with 3 words that he whispered into the dust, his world and his purpose were irrevocably changed. I need help. The sun beat down, turning the canyon into an oven. Elias lay behind the rocks, sweat stinging his eyes, his mind racing. He was a doctor, trained to diagnose, to treat, to heal. But there was no diagnosis for a bullet, no cure for a well-aimed rifle shot from an unseen enemy. His education had not prepared him for this. Boston had been a world of polite society, of ailments that could be understood and addressed in sterile operating theaters. Here, the most lethal disease was greed, and its primary symptom was violence. He risked another look. The trail ahead was empty. The trail behind was empty. The shooter was somewhere in the rim rock above, a patient predator waiting for the prey to break cover. He thought of the Tanner boy, his legs shattered, waiting for a help that might never arrive. The thought was a spike of guilt in his gut. He had made a promise. Hours crawled by. The sun began its slow descent, painting the canyon walls in hues of orange and deep purple. Thirst was a raw ache in his throat. He knew he couldn't stay here all night. The cold of the desert was as dangerous as the heat. He had to move. He had to get to his horse, to his bag. He waited until the shadows grew long and the light became deceptive. Taking a deep breath, he bolted from behind the rocks, running in a low crouch towards Gideon. The expected rifle crack did not come. He reached the horse, grabbing the reins and soothing the nervous animal with a low voice. His hands shook as he fumbled for the canteen, gulping down the lukewarm water. Still nothing. Had the shooter given up? Or was this a game, a cat-to-mouse torment designed to break his nerve? He didn't wait to find out. Leading Gideon, he stayed off the main path, picking his way through the treacherous scree and thorny brush along the canyon floor. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Every shadow held a threat. He finally reached the Tanner homestead well after dusk, a single lantern glowing like a lonely star in the vast darkness. The family's relief at seeing him was quickly overshadowed by their fear. John Tanner, a man whose face was a roadmap of hardship, met him at the door, his own rifle in hand. "We heard the shots, Doc," he said, his voice low and grim. "We figured Croft boys had finally made their move." Inside, the boy, maybe 10 years old, lay pale-faced on a cot, his leg grotesquely swollen. Elias pushed his own terror aside, the familiar rituals of his profession a comforting anchor. He washed his hands, opened his bag, and went to work. The fracture was bad, a compound break of the tibia. He worked by the flickering lantern light, his movements precise and economical. He administered laudanum for the pain, cleaned the wound, and began the delicate, arduous process of setting the bone. The Tanners watched in silence, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and anxiety. For these people, a doctor was a miracle worker, a man who stood between them and the finality of death or crippling injury. Tonight, he felt like a fraud. He had mended the boy's leg, but he couldn't mend the fear that now permeated this small cabin. He couldn't stop the next bullet. When he was finished, he sat with the family, sharing a meager meal of cornbread and beans. "Croft wants this water," Mary Tanner said, her voice barely a whisper. "The spring on our land is the only one that ain't gone dry this season." He wants it for his cattle. He's tried to buy us out, scare us out. Now, her voice trailed off. Now he's trying to kill the only man who can patch us up when his boys get rough. John finished for her, his eyes hard. Elias had no answer. He was just one man. As he rode back to redemption under the cold light of a full moon, the sense of isolation was overwhelming. The town offered no safety. The law offered no protection. The vast, indifferent landscape offered no shelter. He felt the phantom passage of the bullet by his ear again and again. He arrived back at his small adobe clinic just before dawn, exhausted to his bones. As he lit a lamp, the light fell across his reflection in the window pane. A tired, scared man stared back at him, and on his shoulder, a dark tear in the white fabric of his coat where he'd scraped it against the rocks. It looked like a wound, a premonition. His clinic was a simple two-room building on the edge of town, deliberately placed to be accessible to all. One room served as his examination and operating space, the other as his sparse living quarters. It was here, in the quiet solitude of his work, that he found a semblance of peace. He spent his days treating the coughs of miners' children, the injuries of ranch hands, and the various ailments of the townsfolk. But he also treated those others ignored. He'd set the broken arm of a Mexican freighter and stitched a wound for an old Apache woman who had come to him silently, offering a small, intricately beaded pouch as payment. This refusal to acknowledge the town's unwritten rules of segregation was the root of the trouble. And his most recent patient, the one who had truly set him on a collision course with Croft, was an Apache boy. The boy had been afflicted with a fever that Elias had not recognized, a sickness that did not respond to quinine or any of his conventional treatments. Desperate, he had ridden out to the small, isolated settlement where the boy's family lived, a collection of traditional wickiups tucked away in a hidden cove by a creek. It was there he first saw her, Nalin. She was the boy's aunt, a widow whose husband had been a casualty of the ever-simmering conflict with the settlers. She moved with a stillness that was not empty, but full of a deep, quiet power. Her face, framed by two long braids of shining black hair, was a mask of sorrow, yet her eyes held an unnerving intelligence. They watched him as he worked, missing nothing. He had failed with the boy. His medicines had done nothing. Frustrated and humbled, he had finally sat back, admitting defeat. It was then that Nalin had stepped forward. She said nothing to him. She moved to a collection of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling of the wickiup, her long fingers selecting specific leaves and roots. She ground them into a paste with a smooth river stone, mixed it with water, and gently coaxed the boy to drink. Then, she brewed a tea from other plants and used it to bathe his forehead. Elias had watched, a skeptic by nature and training, yet unable to deny the evidence before him. Over the next 2 days, under Nalin's care, the boy's fever broke. His strength returned. Elias had been a witness to a form of medicine far older than his own, a knowledge born of the very land that he found so hostile. He had tried to thank her, but his words felt clumsy, inadequate. She had simply nodded, her gaze profound and unreadable. But a connection had been made, a silent acknowledgement of mutual respect. He was the white doctor who had been willing to try, and to fail, and to learn. She was the Apache healer who had saved her nephew. This act of crossing the cultural divide was his greatest sin in the eyes of Silas Croft. Croft's men had seen him leaving the Apache encampment. The whispers in town started the next day. Indian lover, witch doctor, the taunts had escalated, culminating in the ambush in the canyon. Now, standing in his clinic, the memory of Nalin's quiet competence was a stark contrast to his own feeling of helpless fear. He ran a hand over his face, the stubble rasping against his palm. He needed more than medicine to survive here. He needed a different kind of knowledge. A few days later, another warning came. A rock thrown through his clinic window in the middle of the night, wrapped in a piece of paper. The message was crude, written in charcoal. Get out or get buried. The sheriff, a portly man named Biddle with a perpetual sheen of sweat on his brow, was predictably unhelpful. Probably just some drunk kids, Doc, he'd said, avoiding Elias's gaze. This is a rough town. You'll get used to it. But Elias knew it wasn't kids. It was Croft. The pressure was mounting, a slow, relentless tightening of a noose. He found himself looking over his shoulder constantly, starting at loud noises. The open street felt like a shooting gallery. He began taking his calls at night, hoping the darkness would provide some cover. It was during this period of escalating fear that he saw Nalin again. He was gathering supplies at the mercantile when she entered, moving with her characteristic silent grace. She was there to trade for flour and salt, and the store owner, a man named Henderson, treated her with a cold, barely civil efficiency. The other customers, a pair of ranchers' wives, pulled their skirts aside as if to avoid contamination, their faces masks of disdain. Nalin seemed not to notice, or perhaps she was so accustomed to it that it no longer registered. Her composure was absolute, but Elias saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, the tightening of her jaw. He saw the profound loneliness of her position, a woman caught between a world that was dying and a world that would not have her. On impulse, as she was leaving, he stepped outside and approached her. "Nalin," he said, his voice quiet. She stopped, turning to face him. She did not smile, but the hard line of her mouth softened almost imperceptibly. He felt awkward, unsure of what to say. I want to thank you again. For your nephew." She simply inclined her head, a gesture of acknowledgement. "Your knowledge of the plants," he stammered, feeling like a fool. "It's remarkable. I was wondering if you could teach me." It was a desperate, grasping plea, born of his own inadequacy. He needed her wisdom, not just for his patients, but for himself. He needed something the men with rifles could not understand. A long silence stretched between them, thick with the unspoken tensions of their two worlds. He expected her to refuse, to turn and walk away. Instead, she studied his face, her dark eyes searching for something. She saw the fear he tried so hard to hide. She saw the exhaustion, and perhaps she saw the genuine respect he held for her. Finally, she gave a single, sharp nod. "Come," she said, her voice low and melodic. It was the first word she had ever spoken directly to him. "To the creek, at sunrise." And with that, she turned and walked away, her straight back a silent testament to her resilience. Elias watched her go, a strange sense of hope blooming in his chest for the first time in weeks. It felt like being thrown a lifeline. The next morning, he met her as instructed. The air was cool and clean, the world washed in the soft pastels of dawn. Nalin was already there, waiting by the water's edge. For the next several hours, she walked with him, pointing out the plants he had overlooked 100 times. She showed him willow bark for pain, yarrow to stop bleeding, and a root that, when chewed, could ward off fatigue. She spoke very little. Her teaching was in the showing, in the crushing of a leaf to release its scent, in the way she indicated a plant's location by the type of soil it grew in. He was a diligent student, taking notes in a small leather-bound journal, sketching the leaves and flowers. He was in her world now, a world of subtle signs and deep connections to the earth. The language of science, of Latin names and chemical compounds, felt clumsy and foreign here. Her knowledge was practical, holistic, and alive. They did this for several days. A routine developed. He would meet her at dawn, they would walk for hours, and he would return to his clinic with new knowledge and a growing sense of wonder. A quiet camaraderie grew between them. They rarely spoke of personal matters, but in the shared silence, an understanding bloomed. He learned of the weight of her grief, not from words, but from the profound sadness that sometimes clouded her eyes when she looked towards the mountains where her husband was buried. She, in turn, saw his loneliness, the way he held himself apart from the boisterous, violent world of the town. One morning, as they were returning, they found the carcass of a deer, freshly killed, with a single bullet hole in its side. It was a clear message left on their path, a warning to her as well as to him. Do not consort with the enemy. Elias saw the way Nalin's hands clenched into fists, the rigid set of her shoulders. He felt a surge of protective anger. "This has to stop," he said, his voice rough. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "They will not stop," she said, her voice flat with certainty. "Men like Croft do not stop until they have taken everything." That afternoon, another attempt was made on his life. He was in his clinic, organizing the herbs he had gathered, when a shot rang out. The bullet smashed through the newly replaced window pane and slammed into the wall just behind his head, showering him with plaster dust and splinters of glass. He dropped to the floor, his heart pounding. This was an escalation. They were no longer content to ambush him on the road. They were willing to shoot him in the middle of town in broad daylight. The flimsy protection of his clinic walls had been violated. He stayed on the floor for a long time, the smell of gunpowder sharp in his nostrils. The fear was a cold, metallic taste in his mouth. He knew, with a dreadful finality, that his time was running out. Croft would not miss forever. That evening, he didn't light a lamp. He sat in the darkness, the shattered window a gaping maw letting in the cold night air. He felt utterly defeated. He thought about leaving, about packing his bags, and taking the next stagecoach back east, back to a world where disagreements were settled with words, not bullets. But then he thought of the Tanner boy, of the old Apache woman, of the community that depended on him. He thought of Nalin, of her quiet strength and her profound dignity in the face of constant prejudice. To leave would be to abandon them all. It would be to let Silas Croft win. His gaze fell upon his white coat, draped over a chair. In the faint moonlight, the bullet hole in the wall behind it looked like a dark, accusing eye. The coat was the problem. It made him a target. It was a symbol of everything his enemies hated. A soft knock came at his back door, so quiet he almost thought he'd imagined it. He froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the old Colt revolver he kept in his desk drawer but had never fired. "Doctor," a voice whispered. It was Nalin. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and went to the door. He opened a crack. She stood there, a silhouette against the starry sky, a small bundle in her hands. She slipped inside without a word, her eyes immediately finding the new bullet hole in the wall. She looked from the wall to him, her gaze taking in his disheveled state, the fear he could not hide. She said nothing about the attack. She didn't need to. She simply held out her hand towards the chair where his coat lay. "I will mend it," she said. It was not a question or an offer, but a statement of fact. He hesitated. The coat was his, a symbol of his identity. But in her eyes, he saw not pity, but a fierce, protective resolve. He nodded slowly, fetching the coat for her. She took it from him, the white linen stark against her dark, capable hands. She ran her fingers over the fabric, her touch gentle, reverent. Then, she unrolled the bundle she carried. In the dim light, he saw that it contained several feathers. They were hawk feathers, sleek and brown-tipped, sacred symbols of her people. They represented keen sight, strength, and the protection of the spirit world. He watched, mesmerized, as she sat on the floor and began to work. With a bone needle and thread made from sinew, she did not simply patch the coat. She carefully opened the seam of the inner lining, her movements deft and sure. One by one, she took the feathers and, with a quiet intensity that felt like a prayer, she sewed them into the lining of the coat, hidden from view. She worked in silence, her face serene, her focus absolute. It was a ritual, an act of faith, a weaving of her world into his. Elias stood motionless, a man of science, witnessing an act of pure, unadulterated magic. Every part of his education screamed at him that this was superstition, a primitive belief with no basis in reality. Feathers could not stop a bullet, and yet he could not deny the power of the moment. He could not deny the profound care with which she worked. She was sewing her strength, her spirit, into the very fabric of his identity. When she was finished, she stitched the lining closed so skillfully that the seam was invisible. She smoothed the fabric and folded the coat neatly before handing it back to him. It felt different in his hands, heavier, imbued with a significance that had nothing to do with its physical weight. "For protection," she said softly, her eyes meeting his in the darkness. So they cannot see you. So the bullets do not know you. He had no words. He could not bring himself to voice his skepticism. It would have felt like a sacrilege, a betrayal of the incredible gift she had just given him. He simply took the coat, his fingers brushing hers. The brief touch sent a jolt through him, a connection that was deeper than any words. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. She gave a small, solemn nod, and then, as silently as she had arrived, she slipped back out into the night, leaving him alone with the coat, the darkness, and the fragile, burgeoning hope that he might just survive. The next day, Elias put on the coat. The fabric felt the same, but the weight of it, the feeling of it on his shoulders, had changed. He felt the hidden presence of the feathers against his back, a secret warmth. Walking out into the street felt different. The stares of Croft's men were still there. The tension in the air was just as thick, but his own fear had receded. It was replaced by a strange sense of calm, an almost preternatural awareness. He noticed the way a curtain twitched in a window across the street, the nervous flight of a sparrow from a rooftop. It was as if Nalin's gift of hawk feathers had given him a measure of the hawk's own sight. He was a man of logic. He told himself it was psychological. Her gesture had given him confidence, and that confidence altered his posture, his walk, the way he met the world. It was a placebo, a powerful one, but a placebo nonetheless. But as he went about his day, the feeling of being shielded, of being cloaked in something more than linen, persisted. The true test came 2 days later. A message arrived, urgent and scrawled on a piece of brown paper. It was from the Tanner homestead again. The boy's fever had returned, a secondary infection setting in around the break. Elias knew he had to go, and he knew it was a trap. Croft would be expecting him to take the canyon road. This time they would not miss. He packed his bag, his movements deliberate. He put on his hat, and then he put on the coat. He looked at his reflection. The man staring back was still tired, still worried, but the hunted look in his eyes was gone. He left his clinic and walked, not to the livery, but towards the edge of town, towards the creek where he had met Nalan. He knew a different path now, a hidden trail through the foothills that she had shown him, a path the white men did not know. Even so, they were waiting. He was halfway to the homestead, moving through a thicket of juniper, when he heard the telltale click of a rifle hammer being cocked. He didn't have time to dive for cover. He just froze, his body tensing for the impact. The shot exploded through the quiet air. He heard the whistle of the bullet, but it wasn't a clean miss. It was something stranger. The bullet tore through the loose fabric of his coat sleeve, a violent tug that spun him half around, but it didn't touch his skin. It was as if he had moved a split second before the shot was fired, a reflexive, instinctive motion he hadn't even been aware of making. A second shot followed, just as quickly. This one splintered the trunk of a juniper tree right where his chest had been a moment before. He had ducked without thinking, his body reacting with a speed and certainty that stunned him. He scrambled behind a rock outcropping, his heart hammering, but it was a different kind of fear this time. It wasn't the paralyzing terror of a victim. It was the adrenaline-fueled shock of a survivor. He peered out. He saw them this time, 2 of Croft's men, their rifles raised, their faces contorted with confusion. They had seen him. They had aimed at him. He was an easy target, and yet he was untouched. They fired again, and again he felt that strange sense of prescience, moving just enough, just in time, as a bullet ricocheted off the rock near his head. They must have thought the place was haunted, or that he was some kind of devil. Cursing, they retreated back towards the canyon, unwilling to push their luck. Elias waited until the sound of their horses faded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He slowly stood up, brushing the dust from his trousers. He looked down at his arm. A clean, round hole had been punched through the sleeve of his coat. Beneath it, his skin was perfectly whole. He reached inside the coat, his fingers trembling, and felt the smooth, reassuring shape of the feathers sewn into the lining. His scientific mind searched frantically for an explanation. The loose coat? The shooter's poor aim? The deceptive light? None of it was enough. None of it could explain the feeling he'd had, the certainty of movement, the sense of being guided away from harm. He finished his journey to the Tanner homestead, his mind in a turmoil. He treated the boy, his hand steady now, his focus clear. But all the while, he was thinking of Nalin, of her quiet faith and the impossible power she had woven into his coat. That night, he didn't go back to his clinic. He went to her. He found her outside her wickiup, grinding corn on a flat stone. She looked up as he approached, her expression calm, as if she had been expecting him. He didn't need to tell her what had happened. She saw it in his eyes, in the way he carried himself. He stood before her, the man of science stripped of all his certainties. He held out his arm, showing her the bullet hole in the sleeve. "They missed," he said, his voice raw with awe and disbelief. She stopped her work, her eyes lifting to meet his. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It was the first time he had ever seen her smile. It transformed her face, softening the lines of grief and revealing a startling beauty. "The hawk is a good protector," she said simply. In that moment, the wall between their worlds crumbled into dust. He was no longer just the white doctor, and she was no longer just the Apache widow. They were two people bound by a shared threat and a shared miracle. He looked at the bullet hole, then back at her, and he knew that his life was no longer solely his own. He owed it to her faith. "Croft will not stop," Elias said, the words a stark reality in the quiet dusk. "He tried to kill me. He will try again, and he will continue to terrorize the Tanners and your people until he has that land." Nalin rose, wiping her hands on her deerskin dress. "We know," she said. The "we" was significant. It was the voice of her people, a community that had endured generations of men like Croft. "We have fought men like him before. Fighting with guns is not the answer," Elias said, thinking of the violence he had witnessed, the fear it bred. "He has more men, more guns. We would lose." He looked down at his hands made for healing, not for killing. "There has to be another way. His power comes from fear, from a belief that he is untouchable, that the law is on his side." Nalin watched him, her gaze thoughtful. "And you? You're not afraid of him now?" Elias considered the question. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was different. It was no longer paralyzing. The coat, and the woman who had enchanted it, had given him something more powerful than courage. They had given him conviction. "I am afraid of what will happen if no one stands up to him," he replied. "I'm afraid of letting him win." A decision formed between them, unspoken but absolute. They would not run. They would not hide. They would face Croft, not on his terms, with violence and intimidation, but on theirs, with truth and unity. The plan was simple and incredibly dangerous. Croft's power base was the town itself. He controlled it because the people were divided and afraid. Elias, the doctor, was respected by many of the poorer settlers and miners he had treated. Nalin, though ostracized, was the quiet heart of her Apache community. If they stood together, publicly, they could expose Croft for what he was, a bully and a thief. The next day was Sunday. It was the one day of the week when the town gathered, when people from the outlying homesteads came in for supplies and to attend the small wooden church. It was the perfect stage. Elias walked from his clinic towards the center of town. He wore the coat. It was clean, but he had left the bullet hole in the sleeve unmended. It was a statement. He felt the familiar stares, but today he met them, his gaze steady. As he approached the mercantile, where a crowd was beginning to gather, he saw Nalin. She was walking from the other end of the street, coming from the direction of the creek. She was not dressed in her usual simple work clothes. She wore a ceremonial dress of soft, white deerskin, adorned with intricate beadwork that shimmered in the morning sun. In her hair, she wore a single hawk feather. She walked with a regal dignity that silenced the usual murmurs and drew every eye. The Apache widow, who so rarely entered the town, was walking down the center of the main street as if she owned it. She stopped beside him, and they stood together in the dusty square, a silent, defiant tableau. The white doctor in his bullet-torn coat and the Apache woman in her sacred dress. It was a sight so shocking, so contrary to the town's rigid social order, that a hush fell over the onlookers. As if on cue, Silas Croft and 4 of his men rounded the corner on horseback. They reined in sharply, their expressions a mixture of surprise and contempt. Croft, a big man with a florid face and eyes as cold as a winter sky, swung down from his saddle. "Well, well," he boomed, his voice dripping with menace. "Look what we have here. The witch doctor and his squaw. I knew you were an Indian lover, Thorne, but I didn't think you'd be so bold as to flaunt it in front of decent folk." A few of his cronies chuckled, but the sound was nervous. The crowd was not joining in. They were watching, waiting. Elias stood his ground. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the gun he wasn't wearing. "These are decent folk, Croft," he said, his voice carrying in the stillness. "The tanners are decent folk. The miners you cheat are decent folk. The people whose wells you're trying to steal are decent folk." Croft's face darkened with rage. "You've been warned, Thorne. You should have taken that stagecoach back to whatever pampered city you crawled out of." He took a step forward, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. "This is my town, my land, and I will not have it polluted by your filth." "It's not your land," a voice said. It was not Elias. It was John Tanner. He had stepped out from the crowd, his wife Mary beside him. He was unarmed, his face pale but resolute. "You've been trying to scare us off for months, but we ain't leaving." A murmur went through the crowd. Another man, a miner whose son Elias had treated for black lung, stepped forward. "And you ain't talking our water." Croft was losing control. His power was based on the illusion of universal support, an illusion that was now shattering before his eyes. His face purpled with fury. He looked from Tanner to the miner, and then his eyes settled on Elias, the source of this rebellion. "You," he snarled, his voice a low growl. "This is your doing." He drew his pistol. Tom seemed to slow down. The crowd gasped. Mary Tanner screamed. Croft aimed his gun, not at Elias's chest, but at his head. A kill shot, an execution. But standing beside Elias, Nalin did not flinch. She simply raised her hand, palm out, a gesture of warding, of peace, of immense spiritual power. And in that split second, one of Croft's younger, more nervous men, startled by the sudden movement, flinched. His own gun, which he had already drawn, went off. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space of the street. It was not aimed at Elias. It was a panicked, accidental discharge. But the bullet, fired from an angle, flew straight towards him. Elias saw the flash, heard the roar. He felt a violent, wrenching tug at his shoulder, so powerful it knocked him off his feet. He fell backwards into the dust, the world spinning. For a moment, there was absolute silence. The crowd stared, horrified, certain he was dead. Croft stood frozen, his own gun still raised, a look of shock on his face. Then, slowly, Elias pushed himself up. He was alive. He was unhurt. He looked down at his shoulder. The bullet had ripped a ragged gash through the thickest part of his coat, tearing the fabric wide open. And there, nestled in the white linen and exposed for all to see, were the hawk feathers. They lay untouched, serene, sewn into the lining. The bullet had passed through the coat, front and back, but it had not touched him. It was as if he had been a ghost, a phantom in the path of the lead. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It wasn't just a miss. It was a miracle. They had all seen it. The magic was real. Sheriff Biddle, who had been cowering near the saloon doors, saw the look on the faces of the townsfolk. He saw the awe, the shift in allegiance. He saw that Croft's power had just evaporated in a puff of smoke and superstition. His political instincts, long dormant, kicked in. He finally drew his own pistol. "Croft," Biddle said, his voice surprisingly firm. "You and your men, drop your guns. You're under arrest for attempted murder." Croft stared at him, dumbfounded. Then he looked at the faces in the crowd, no longer fearful, but accusatory. He looked at Elias, standing tall in his torn coat. He looked at Nalin, her expression calm and triumphant. His reign was over. Defeated, he let his gun fall into the dust. The immediate aftermath was a blur of quiet relief and hushed wonder. As Sheriff Biddle, with a newfound sense of duty, led Croft and his men away. The townsfolk slowly closed in, not with hostility, but with a tentative respect. John Tanner clapped a hand on Elias's uninjured shoulder, his eyes wet with gratitude. Mary Tanner approached Nalin and, after a moment's hesitation, pressed a small cloth-wrapped bundle into her hands. It was freshly baked bread, a simple offering, an apology and a beginning. Elias and Nalin stood together in the center of the street, the dust settling around them. The gulf between them, the chasm of race and culture, had been bridged. In the eyes of the town, they were no longer just the doctor and the Apache. They were the two who had faced down Silas Croft and won, not with bullets, but with a courage that defied explanation. A quiet understanding passed between them, more profound than any words. He looked at the torn fabric of his coat, at the exposed feathers that had saved his life. He felt no need to analyze it, to reduce the miracle to a set of logical possibilities. He simply accepted it. He accepted her. Later that evening, the air had cooled, carrying the scent of pine from the high country. They sat not at his clinic, nor at her wickiup, but on a flat rock overlooking the creek, the space between their two worlds. The town of Redemption lay below them, a cluster of quiet lights. For the first time, it looked like a place that might one day live up to its name. Elias had the coat spread across his lap. With a needle and thread from his medical kit, he began to stitch the ragged tear in the fabric. His stitches were small and neat, the work of a surgeon. Nalin watched him, her hands resting in her lap. The silence between them was comfortable, companionable, filled with the weight of all they had overcome. As he worked, his needle carefully navigating around the sacred feathers, he felt Nalin's hand gently cover his. He stopped, looking up at her. Her face, illuminated by the soft glow of the rising moon, was serene. Her eyes held a deep, quiet joy. She was no longer just a widow defined by her grief. She was a protector, a healer whose wisdom had saved a man and helped liberate a town. And he was no longer the lonely, frightened doctor, an outsider in a hostile land. He was a man who had found his place, his purpose, and an unexpected, profound connection that transcended everything he had ever known. He finished his stitch, tying off the thread. The coat was scarred but whole. It was more than just a garment now. It was a testament, a story woven in linen and sinew, science and spirit. He folded it carefully and set it aside. He looked at Nalin, at the woman who had sewed feathers into his coat, and, in doing so, had sewed her life into his. He reached out, his hand finding hers in the quiet twilight, and in that simple, grounding touch, he knew he had not just been saved from a bullet. He had found his home. I am a storyteller, and I weave tales of the American West, of its hardships, its beauty, and the unexpected ways people find connection and courage. The story of Elias and Nalin is a testament to the idea that strength can come from the most unlikely of sources, and that faith, in any form, can be a shield against the darkest of threats. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below.